Hi, welcome back to Cult Hackers. We're still officially on that break, but I'm hopping onto the mic from time to time when I find a topic that I want to think out loud about. So 2024 is the year of the vote. Nearly half of the world is voting in around 64 countries, plus the European Union. Of course, that's a group of countries, but they also have representatives within each nation, so they're being voted in too. So that's around 4 billion people that are going to be going to the polls this year. It's amazing. But there will be around 8 million of those people who won't be casting their vote for anybody. And those are Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't vote. Some countries demand that you vote, but you can spoil your ballot. So that's what Jehovah's Witnesses do in those countries. So I think Australia is a country where you have to vote, but you can go and just put a tick in all the boxes, or you can write something in. I think some Jehovah's Witnesses write in God's kingdom, something like that. So they're within their rights to do that, but you have to go and actually vote. In fact, it's interesting to note that Jehovah's Witnesses can be counted as disassociated. So it's one of these strange things. In order, I think, to get round legal problems, you can't say to somebody, we're going to disfellowship you or kick you out if you vote or if you join the army. But what they'd say is that by doing that, they've disassociated themselves, so they've left the organisation. But the end result is the same. They're shunned. So if you vote, you can get shunned, basically. You're not supposed to vote at all. It is a rule. The stated reason is to maintain political neutrality. So Jehovah's Witnesses don't stand for office or take part in wars either. And they claim scriptural precedence for this by saying that Jesus never got involved in the political affairs of his day. Although, of course, there's a lot we don't know about what Jesus did. The Gospels, so far as we can trust what they say, talk about his ministry effectively, don't they? There's not much about what he did outside of that. Anyway, the Bible is certainly full of politics, and according to the Hebrew Bible, faithful men, I'm thinking about people like Daniel in particular, he's an example. They rose to lofty politics or political office. So, there was no problem with being in politics in those times. Anyway, I'm not going to debate about the biblical rights and wrongs about this position, but I would like to talk about the effect that this decision has on the members of the organisation and other organisations that do the same sorts of thing, and also what happens when you leave. So how does that affect you? And one of the things that I realised as I left the organisation over 25 years ago was that I was called a witness, but I felt like a bystander. There's a strange feeling of detachment from the community when you're a Jehovah's Witness. And this can impact upon how you interact with the world. In fact, it does determine how you interact with the world, and it's not an accident. Jehovah's Witnesses are constantly encouraged to be no part of the world. This is a quote from a statement that Jesus made, but again, it's interpreted in a certain way. It's interpreted as meaning that Christians should not interact with people any more than it is necessary to do. So, they understand that you have to earn a living, you go to work, maybe you go shopping, you might say hello to your neighbour. You're also encouraged to be likeable. So in the workplace or at school, for instance, you're encouraged to be likeable, to set a good example, because you want to make people like you and think that you're a good person. It's called giving a good witness. The idea is that maybe people will notice your conduct and then become a Jehovah's Witness themselves. So you want people to like you, but you also want to keep them at arm's length. And that's not always a comfortable place to be, because, of course, if people like you, then they'll do things like invite you round for a meal, or maybe say, let's go out on a trip or something together, and you're not really supposed to do that. This starts at school, and for those that go to school, some parents teach their kids at home these days, but And for those that go to school, it's understood that you're going to have friends at school. So these are worldly friends, but that's considered normal and okay, but not outside of school. So too much association outside of school hours is very much discouraged, as is doing extracurricular activities like playing sport, going to dance classes, anything really that means you're spending more time with worldly people than you need to. Now, there is some variation, I think, in how strictly different parents police this, but nevertheless, the counsel is to avoid bad association. That famous scripture, bad association spoil useful habits, is again used and interpreted as meaning that children shouldn't have anything to do with other children who are not Jehovah's Witnesses, really, because that's bad association, and that will spoil your useful habits of things like going on the ministry or doing things for the organisation. Also, things like schools doing mock elections. There might be a limited amount of democracy in schools. Things like class representatives or class presidents. These are kind of positions where sometimes they're voted in by the school kids and they represent the students in certain things. Again, Jehovah's Witnesses wouldn't really have anything to do with that. And also, there's sometimes actual mock elections. So at the time of an election, some schools I know are doing the elections at school to see how they are voting. Of course, they can't vote for real, but they can do it pretend, and that gives you a picture of how kids are thinking. Often it really reflects what their parents think, but still interesting. And it gives them a sense. It teaches children about democracy. But of course, Jehovah's Witnesses children are not permitted to take part in that, so they don't have anything to do with that. So this pattern of being sort of separate from the world is repeated upon becoming an adult and being able to vote. Some cultures see voting as a kind of rite of passage, which of course is denied by Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I think this has a psychological effect on a person. It means that you become an observer of the social world, not a participant. I think it's an important element in removing people's agency and autonomy. It's a way of stopping you basically having any power. Government, both local and national, gets elected by other people. Other people debate about the merits of this particular policy or that particular policy, or this political leader or that political leader, or this party or that party. Other people talk about that, not us. Laws get passed, of course, by these governments that affect you, but you have no recourse. You have no power to vote them out next time, or even to lobby to change the law. You just passively accept whatever happens to you. So although the organisation's official position is that they respect the governmental authorities, pay your taxes and obey the laws, that sort of thing, individual witnesses generally hold politicians in disdain. They will generally repeat tropes that they're all just as bad as one another and that they all tell lies, they're all corrupt. And of course, it's easy to carp and criticise from the sidelines, but not so easy when you have to roll your sleeves up and do something about it. So I think they should just shut up about politics. If they're not having anything to do with it, if they're remaining neutral, then have nothing to say. Have the decency to keep quiet about these issues. If you want to have a say, then at very least you should be voting. So since leaving, I've become very interested in politics. I'm not an activist, but I am very interested in politics. I think the way we organise society is fascinating and important. Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots wrong with politics and politicians, and I think that's part of the reason why, we'll come to it later, why there is a problem at the moment with politics. But you can't improve something by refusing to have anything to do with it. So in the UK, we're under 2 weeks away from a general election. And according to the polls, we're in for a massive defeat for the currently ruling party, the Conservatives. I suppose if you're listening in the States, that's more like the Republican Party. It looks like the other main party, Labour, is going to win a large majority, and I'll be proudly casting my vote when it comes to it. And I thought I'd just think back to the first time that I voted, and of course, for some listeners, it might be coming up this year, the first time they get a chance to vote. So I just wanted to reflect on that, and it is a thrilling time. It's a thrilling feeling going in. You get your little pen and you put your cross in that little box of the party you want or the person you want to vote for. And that's a great feeling. When you're newly out, it's a brilliant feeling to do it, not just because of the act of voting itself, but also because it's like a symbol of being part of the community in which you live. It's empowering. You're no longer just an observer carping from the sidelines, hoping that it's all going to be destroyed soon. No, you have a part in this society. You're one of the stakeholders. Although, of course, your individual power is very small, at least you have some, and you can contribute. Jehovah's Witnesses don't vote, basically because they believe that it does not belong to man to rule over himself or herself. That we actually should have a theocracy. So, according to Jehovah's Witness theology, the original sin of Adam and Eve was believing that they could make their own rules and basically rule over themselves, make determination about what they do themselves. Jehovah's Witnesses think that's a mistake, and they want God to rule directly over us again, and that's essentially a theocracy. But as I've mentioned before, I think the last podcast, theocracies always end up having earthly representatives. I would say they have to, because I don't think there is a God who is actually ruling. So the people that end up being proxies for God are the ones then that are seen as in charge. So they get to decide what the rules are, what the laws are. And they claim either that they are getting this information from God directly or indirectly, or more often these days that they're interpreting some holy writings from his word, so they are the ones who determine what happens. But make no mistake, there will be politics in those sorts of arrangements. While people don't get to vote, there will certainly be politics about who's coming in power, who's got some power behind them, who has the most votes within the clique that determine who's going to be in charge. All of that will still be present. Anyway, I don't want to be ruled by the God of the Hebrew Scriptures. No, thank you. The example of what that would be like is actually in the Bible. So we kind of have a manifesto for what that would be like. It's in the Hebrew Scriptures. And what do we find there? Well, we find regular animal sacrifice. I don't want to be doing that. And of course, the claim is that was a foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice, so we wouldn't be doing that. But okay, that's what we did last time we had God's rule. Strict rules about everything from what you can wear, even what material that's made out of, what you can eat, who you can marry. If you get any of these things wrong, by the way, you can be punished by brutal means, including stoning somebody to death. A more barbarous practice it's hard to imagine. In fact, I remember going to a drama once. We used to have at the big district assemblies dramas where people would kind of act out on the field a particular play based on the Bible. Of course, these days they do these dramas as films and so on, but then it was all fairly amateurish. But we kind of look forward to it. It's the most interesting bit of the assembly. So, but I remember one particular one. I think it was the stoning of Stephen, and they recreated Stephen getting stoned. So, of course he was pelted by polystyrene blocks, but still, I mean, when I think about it now, that's absolutely awful. You've got kids watching in the audience while this guy gets mock stoned. Anyway, it's awful. I don't want to live in a world ruled by a God that thinks that's okay. It also, going back to the direct rule by God, it also included codifying of slavery and polygamy. This is what you can do. this is how you should keep slaves and how you should treat slaves. So slavery was okay, it was codified. And there were also constant brutal wars where whole peoples were slaughtered, which now we describe as genocide. So no, I don't want to be ruled by that sort of rulership. So I'm not hanging on for that type of government, I'm afraid. And in a way, this kind of brings me on to my final point, where I'm going to get a little bit political. So, everybody's got a right to disagree with me about this, but one of the wonderful things about leaving a high control religion is that you now can say what you think and how you feel. So, I'm going to do it. I've got a mic and I'm going to do it. You can do it too. So yeah, there's something about democracy which is kind of worrying me. And of course, that's the downside of being part of the world and having a stake in it, is that you now care about it. You care about what happens. You can't just give yourself the deluded luxury of ignoring everything and imagining that God is going to put it all right. So what's worrying me? Well, I feel that over the last 10 years or so, things have shifted within democracies and within politics as a whole, really. I think this is partly because of us taking democracy for granted. I think we imagined that more and more countries were going to become democratic. And of course, we saw with the fall of the Soviet Union, that did mean that we had more democracies spring up. So, when I was a kid, countries like Poland or Ukraine or Hungary or East Germany, these countries didn't have democracy. So we saw a proliferation of democratic states. And I think this made us believe that this was the natural direction of travel. But it seems to be that that's not necessarily the case. And we saw some attempts at democratization in certain parts of the world that didn't happen, thinking particularly about what was called the Arab Spring at one point. That kind of just didn't come to this fruition that people expected. We've also got the rise of China, and China is certainly not democratic. And so, we have these examples of governments that operate on a non-democratic way. So that's always been the case, but I think our assumption that gradually, all nations would become democratic, that hasn't happened. But I'm also worried about democracies themselves that are currently democratic states. I think there's a cynical, too often dishonest political class. We've seen too many dishonest politicians. Certainly in the UK, we've had lots of scandals about politicians doing things, lying, and of course, feathering their own nest, misusing public finances, these sorts of things. This, of course, creates lots of cynicism towards these politicians, and I think it's damaging democracy. There's also too much money in politics, and that means that people with power have outsized influence. So that means, in the UK we have the newspapers that are owned by people who really want to push a certain political agenda. And I know that happens particularly in television, in cable television and so on in the States. And of course it happens in other countries too. And so these people with this outsized influence seem to have more power than everybody else put together. And of course that damages people's confidence in democracy. There's also generally a level of wealth inequality which is ridiculous. We have a few billionaires who, again, because of that, are going to have a lot of power. And we've also got lots of people suffering and struggling with a cost of living crisis in various parts of the world that mean that they don't know where they're going to find their next meal. We have food banks and so on in the UK. We never had that when I was growing up. That's just a new thing. So we have these ridiculous levels of inequality. Some people are absolutely multi-billionaires, and then we have this huge gap, and then there's lots and lots of people who are really struggling. So I think all those things diminish and demean democracy. Why would people want to be involved in a democracy if they don't think that it's having any benefits for them? And I think that's incredibly dangerous. And part of then what happens and what is happening is that we've got very worrying movements and some incredibly dangerous people learning how to manipulate these conditions to meet their own ends and manipulate people to do their bidding. These people cynically play upon fear and prejudice in order to gain power, promising to finally represent the common person's interests when actually all they care about is themselves. In the UK, this is represented by Nigel Farage and his Reform Party, with certain factions in the ruling government, the Conservative Party, also lurching in the same direction. And in the US, it's Donald Trump's MAGA movement. But this isn't just an Anglo-American problem, to coin a phrase. The playbook is the same. We have the same sorts of things happening throughout Europe, Italy, Hungary, Turkey, and other countries where there's a kind of, if not a lurch, a gradual pushing to more authoritarian type governments. These governments are often also anti-science and anti-institution that disagrees with them or holds them to account. And the reason they don't like science sometimes is because, they want to do what they want to do, not be told by so-called experts about things. So they kind of undermine those institutions. And I think that's part of what's happening. I touched on that on the last discussion on this. So I worry that democracy is in trouble. We know through history authoritarian leaders are often voted in the first instance, then they make changes that keeps them in and their friends and their family in power. They also generally don't like anybody that doesn't buy into their greatness, so you have to support them. They have zero tolerance for anybody that disagrees with them, including religious movements, I will say, who want them to be destroyed at Armageddon. So Jehovah's Witnesses, the same people that are not voting in democratic systems, are likely to be one of the big losers if we end up with autocracies. So that's a kind of serious point. So yeah, voting, it is important. I'll be placing my vote on the 4th of July. Yes, my American friends, that is actually the date of our election. So good luck wherever you are on your election year. And I sincerely hope this right that was denied me and so many other people for so long is maintained throughout the world. So, let's use it. So thank you ever so much for listening. And let me know if there's any particular topics that you would like me to think out loud about while we're still putting together what the podcast is going to be in the future. So thank you for listening and speak to you soon. Bye for now.